Welcome to Green Giants, Titans of Renewable Energy, the podcast where insights and innovation meet. Every episode, we dive into conversations with industry leaders, experts, and change makers, bringing you the stories and ideas in the renewable energy sector that shape our world. And now, let's jump into today's episode with your host, Wes Ashworth. Welcome back to Green Giants, Titans of Renewable Energy. Today, I'm joined by Brad Stutzman, CEO of O3 Energy. Brad has spent over 15 years in renewables, navigating the ups and downs and sharp turns of what we often call the solar coaster. He brings a rare mix of financial acumen, real-world construction experience, and a long-term mindset that's grounded in reality. Since founding O3 Energy in 2011, he's helped grow it into a formidable force in commercial and industrial solar, while also pushing into new territory with models like the solar split and a reinvention of how we think about asset management. In this episode, we unpack the emotional endurance required to thrive in renewables, how to lead through uncertainty, and what lessons from history can reframe our future. With that, Brad, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure to have you. And as always, I want to start at the beginning. So before we get into innovation and markets, I want to understand the moments and choices that really brought you into the space and why you stayed. So take us back to your entry point into solar. What convinced you this was more than just a passing trend?
Well, whenever I started off with solar, it was 2009 was whenever the Great Recession hit Texas, or kind of made its way to Texas.
Yeah.
At that time, I had a company with my business partner focused on financing, development, and construction projects, and that kind of came to a screeching halt whenever the recession hit. So Obama came out with the American Recovery Act, had a lot of incentives for solar. Me and my business partner at the time learned how to structure the financing for solar projects because the developers we were working with on real estate started looking at ways they could diversify with the land that they had. And so we made that transition. Didn't necessarily know that it was something that I would stick with, for the long term. I thought maybe whenever it bounced back, into, we come back to real estate. But, here I am 15 years later and, just pushing through things. So that was the turning point that got me into it. But the technology and the love for the industry and the fact that it's kind of the wild, wild west, everything's changing all the time, has really made me love it and stuck with it.
Yeah, cool. And you mentioned some of this in that, but I'll just ask in case there's anything to add. So having success across, finance, real estate, construction, those different industries, and I would say, renewable, you're able to pull all those in, which is really cool. But why stake just your long-term career on renewables and really just, you've made this a career now and a long-term choice?
Yeah. Renewables, it kind of represents, it's kind of convergence of purpose and opportunity.
Yeah.
There's a push, whether or not you believe in, man-made global warming or not, we definitely need to focus on reducing our emissions just because of air quality and the other impacts that we have to the earth. And so it's a purpose-driven industry, and there is a lot of opportunity and growth that we can experience throughout the industry. So it's been an exciting ride over the past 15 years, seeing the ups and the downs, the solar coaster, as they say. That's kind of where it's been. Yeah,
no, it's cool. Kind of going back to launching O3 Energy in 2011, what did you see at that point that maybe others didn't? It took us kind of like back to that moment and what was going through your head and how that all came to be. But what did you see in the market that maybe others didn't see?
So in 2011, what we saw was that there was a huge need for financing in the C&I solar space. There was some groups that were starting on the residential side of things at that time. I think Mosaic was one of the earlier groups that was focused on residential. There wasn't a whole lot of groups that were focused on C&I at that time. Now you see a lot more. And so that was our focus, putting together the projects from a development aspect. We saw a lot of installers that were out there that are like, hey, this customer wants to go solar. They want to convert their property to solar. I can, do the installation. I'm an electrician, but I don't know how to get the project from point A to point B, whether that be through, designing the entire project, because you need more than just the electrical, didn't know how to put together the financing for it, or just the simple documentation of a project like that. And so that's kind of where we started focusing O3 Energy, was to come in, and we partner initially, and we still do partner with, smaller installers and electricians to get those projects off the ground. Now we see more and more, projects that we're dealing with on the front end from just directly B2B with the customer versus through installers and electricians. Yeah. So that was how we got our start. And that was a need that we saw in the industry. Now it's changed a little bit.
Yeah.
And it'll continue to change.
Right. Always evolving.
Yeah.
It's cool to hear those starts though, and how it got going, and kind of thinking about that too. So early days, I always love to get in the head of these founders and what you went through. But what's one of the hardest early decisions you made as a founder that shaped who the company is today?
I would say to focus on that C&I side.
Yeah. Okay.
There were a lot of groups that were going into residential, from a standpoint, and there was a gap, so you've got residential, which is very easy to finance from a consumer credit standpoint.
Yeah.
And then you had the large utility scale projects, which, you have an investment grade off taker with the utility or wherever else. That middle market credit was always difficult.
Yeah.
So, at the time we were, raising private capital to come in and really selling our investors on the opportunity and the tax benefits of these projects. And so I would say that would probably be one of the most difficult decisions.
Yeah. Yeah. Another question. I'm just curious. So if I walked into your office back then, year one of the company starting, what would have surprised me the most?
Ooh, year one of the company starting, we were in an executive suite. So we were actually, so we were working we had a few executive suites, like in a Regis.
Yeah.
Whenever we first started the company. So that would probably be one of the biggest things that surprised you.
When was the moment, or do you remember a moment when you're like, all right, I think we got it. Because I know early on, as much as belief can be there and you're in the right market and you feel like you're solving the right problem, there's still always that uncertainty. Do you remember that moment where you're like, all right, I think this thing is going to work?
Man, well, I think it depends on which day of the week I wake up on, right? Sometimes it's like, okay, yeah, everything's going great. And then, the next day it's like, oh man, is this really working?
Yeah.
But I would say probably about 2 years, maybe 3 years into it was whenever we really got some momentum and we were able to really add on to add some ancillary products onto our offering and really have some company growth there and move out of the Regis and move into a bigger office. So
yeah, there you go. Always love that. It's the entrepreneurial's life, right? Like some days you're right. It's kind of like what day of the week it is and how things are going, but you stay optimistic, stay pushing through. And now that kind of understanding a little bit of that foundation and taking us back to those early days, I want to talk a little bit about staying power. So, you've weathered wild storms in policy, pricing, sentiment over the years and these changes. And I think this is where really experience really becomes a differentiator. And so you've talked about, there's some in the industry now, obviously with the changes in ITC and everything that's coming. There's a bit of, some that haven't maybe seen it. There's a little bit of like caution, panic in some respects. But from your perspective, like what's the real story they're missing? And share some wisdom just from having gone through this a little bit longer.
I would say at the end of the day, we're going to be fine. We've been through this before. The ITC has gone away. It's come back, give it a little bit of time and the industry will adjust. And that's the way it's always been. There's so much momentum going with the industry the way it is now. It's not just going to end overnight. And now that costs have come down so much. Yeah. And the fact that renewables are really needed on the grid, and we've added so much as far as renewables to the grid. The industry is not going anywhere. There may be some pivots and some changes, but again, that's kind of what makes this industry fun.
Yeah, no doubt. I feel like you do got to be hardwired a little bit like that, where it's a little fun. You're like, yeah, some days it's not fun, but overall it's fun, exciting, and challenging. Anything else that you use to just personally stay steady and to stay positive when policy winds shift so quickly or when other changes happen?
Well, I mean, I would say just looking back, what is the old saying? This too shall pass, right?
Right.
Whenever you have good times, this too shall pass. Whenever you have
Yeah.
bad times, this too shall pass. So, I just think about that. It's not the end of the world. Nothing is the end
Right.
of the world, right? Just keep on moving and never give up.
Yeah, I love that. What about what's the most painful period of volatility for your business? So over that time since 2011, is there a particular moment that was probably like the toughest? And then tell us a little bit about it and how you led through it.
I would say one of the toughest times was probably about 2 years ago.
Okay.
Was whenever we closed our residential side of the company. We did
Yeah.
decide to add a residential side of the company. Residential was going so strong, and it actually came around, just kind of by luck or by accident. We were already based in Dallas. We were doing solar. Residential solar really started picking up here, so we were getting a lot of calls already
Mhm.
about residential solar, and so started looking in that direction of why don't we add a residential solar side to the company. And so we had that, we grew it. We did that for, had that side of the company for probably about 6 years.
Yeah.
And then about 2 years ago was whenever we were really seeing interest rates climb, and we were all seeing it across the nation, right? Interest rates climb, inflation, going crazy. And we just were looking at the numbers and seeing that, hey, this just is not working. For us as a business, some of the smaller mom and pops, I think, were still able to adjust. But we just, we had, from a company standpoint, we have so many projects that we had to churn on that side because due to overhead, due to employees, there's so much that you have to churn to really make it pay for itself. And we were just not, starting to get to a point where we weren't hitting that, and we were continuing to see sales fall, but it wasn't through anything that we were doing. It was, market trends, and the numbers were tougher to make sense for a residential customer here in Texas. It still makes a lot of sense in certain areas, but just in general, it didn't make sense. And so to make the decision to close that side of the business and obviously have to lay off all of those employees that were attached to that side of the business,
Yeah.
that was probably one of the toughest decisions right there.
Yeah, without a doubt. It's again, as you said, put it perfectly, it is one of the toughest decisions I think you can make as a business leader,
Right.
business owner. But, ultimately you have to decide, if it's right for the business. And I heard somebody say, it's sort of like investments that basically you take away all the time, effort, and energy you put in. And that's what most people are just married to, the fact that like, God, we did all this, we
Right.
built all this. It's so hard to let go, but it's knowing what you know today. Would you make that investment again today?
Oh, yeah,
Without all of that other
absolutely.
stuff, and that's a really tough exercise to go through, but sometimes it's a necessary one. The other thing I was going to ask you related to this, so we see things shift in the market, changes, policy changes, what have you. I think as business leaders, there's this wrestle sometimes between how much should we pivot, how much should we try to like change and evolve and try to figure out how do we succeed with the market changing, versus this like steady, kind of consistent, stay with what we know, stay by the rim, ride it out, and the weather's going to get better. For you, kind of going through that as a business owner, like what goes through your head, and how do you figure out ultimately which way to go?
Yeah, so we had gone down the path of trying different, I guess, making changes to our residential side. We had spent probably a year trying different sales techniques, trying different additional services to go along with our solar offering on the residential side, generators, ancillary services that made sense from a home improvement side of things. And, some of it would work, some of it didn't, but at the end of the day, it just really came down to the numbers.
Yeah.
Because you are adding some of these other products to try to drive more sales, but then you're bringing in some more costs there. So it really just came down to the numbers and, getting to that point where it's like, we can't just keep throwing money at this side here. And it was actually starting to bring down other sides of the company as well, because in some cases we were kind of subsidizing that side of the business to try to keep it afloat from other sides of the business, mainly our commercial side. And, so it could have taken down the entire company, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Again, these are the tough decisions business
Right.
owners have to make and what you have to go through. But it's a lot of times it's different, and just the willingness to kind of do this exercises, really look at the numbers honestly and figure it out. But I love that. I also just, I love the optimism of like, it's going to be okay. We're going to be all right. The industry will move forward. The industry will survive. It will always find a way. I think it's inevitable, and we'll get into that a little bit more as we go. But shifting a bit from navigating that uncertainty to what you're building in response to it, I want to get into some of the models you're developing at O3. Because they feel like direct answers to the gaps the industry might be ignoring or missing a little bit. What fundamental flaw in the commercial solar market led you to create the solar split model? And feel free to explain that a bit too as well.
Yeah. So for the longest time, what we kept finding is a lot of the commercial property owners that we worked with, we'd reach out to them or sit down with them, explain solar, explained how it could increase the value of their property, so on and so forth. But then at the end of the day, they're not the tenant that pays the electricity.
Yeah.
So, if it's a multifamily property, I have a lot of friends that run, multifamily investment funds, and, spoke with them about, hey, let's look at solar for your properties. And you start sitting down and talking with them. And at the end of the day, there's not enough meat on the bone for them to really make that decision to move forward with it. And so, the solar split allows them to recoup those costs through, in essence, selling the electricity to their tenant. In the past, what we had talked with these building owners about doing was changing their lease or increasing their lease amount to cover the electricity. But at the end of the day, you're just taking a calculated guess of how much electricity this tenant's going to use. How much extra do I have to charge in a lease payment? It's not a true calculation. It's just kind of an educated guess on it. So, that's a tough sale. And so through the solar split, what we're able to do is we're able to allow the property owner to install solar, increase the value of their building, also take the tax credits if they can use the tax credits, and then pass on the electricity to their tenants, provide the tenants savings, and for them to recoup their investment as well, the building owner, for them to recoup their investment as well. So it's kind of a win across the board.
Yeah.
And it's not something that has traditionally been done. And we're leaving out an entire side of the real estate industry by not, having a solution like that previously.
Yeah. It seems to make all the sense in the world. Obviously something new. Sometimes people are just resistant because it's different or they haven't heard it before. So maybe that's it. But anything else in terms of just what was the biggest hurdle in bringing the idea to market, really getting it going, explaining it to, property owners or in a way that really made sense to them? What were some of those hurdles initially and maybe even now? And how did you overcome it?
Yeah. So, mainly the only hurdles with it have been education, right? So, just educating them what it is, because it is something a little bit different. A property owner just looks at it from a standpoint of operating their property. Sometimes they're not sophisticated enough to get into the ins and outs of the true expenses on site or other ways for them to increase their revenue on site, which in this case is another way for them to increase their revenue. So it's really just educating those customers. That's really been the biggest hurdle.
Right. Which, not a bad one to overcome. That's one you can kind of get behind and explain it and have those conversations. Right. And as long as it makes sense, and which it does, they're on board. Switching over a little bit just to thinking about asset management is another obviously topic in your business and what you're looking at right now. But why does asset management remain just an afterthought in solar? And what's the cost of that?
Yeah. So, there's a lot of studies right now about the lost costs of poor asset management and maintenance, deferred maintenance on these solar systems. You've got a lot of groups and I think we saw this because of the success of the industry, right? There were a lot of companies that flooded into the industry. Let's install solar, let's make money off of doing that, but didn't really think of the long-term life cycle of the solar project. Mainly on the C&I side of things is what we're talking about. C&I and then residential. Utility, They always, they're always thinking about that because it's a much larger investment. But, mainly on the C&I side of things, it doesn't seem like there's been a real focus on the asset management or the long-term maintenance of a facility. So, now with what we're seeing in the industry, we're seeing a lot of shift with groups that were doing construction, installing solar systems, getting out of the industry because of the ITC going away. Yeah. We were seeing this before, but now I think it's going to be, multiplied is the amount of stranded assets out there. We had a hotel owner the other day that came to us. We're installing solar on one of their hotels, but this was a hotel in a different state that they had previously installed solar on a few years back. They were talking about their system went out for 2 months. They're a fairly, mid-range hotel. They aren't checking the monitoring system every day.
Yeah.
They have turnover. So the person that may have had access to the monitoring system originally, there's somebody else there. They don't know how to access it. The system was off for 2 months. They didn't realize it until they started getting their electric bill from the utility and saying, holy crap, this thing has doubled, quadrupled. And, they lost $40,000 by, the system being down for 2 months. So, if you have an asset manager or, some sort of maintenance package where somebody can be alerted as quickly as something like that happens, if somebody is actually monitoring that, then, it basically pays for itself. So that's really where we're focused on with our O3 Asset Care.
Yeah.
It's the program that we have.
Yeah, and tell me a bit more about that O3 Asset Care, just overall what people should know, and then what's it solving maybe that others are missing. You mentioned some of that, but anything else just in terms of what's different and why it's working and how it's working, all those good things.
Yeah, so it's mainly the fact that we're monitoring the system for them, and they're kind of a white glove service. They don't have to be hands on. We can send roll trucks if needed, alert the facility manager of the hotel or of the commercial property if it's, something basic like, just to do a visual inspection. A lot of times you run into things that may just be a visual inspection, like, hey, system is not producing because a piece of trash flew up on the module and is covering part of it, or a squirrel got in there and chewed a wire, and hey, we need to roll a truck real quick just to get that done or fixed. So it's really having that sense of urgency with the system and having someone that's proactively watching out for these issues.
Yeah, which as you said, pays for itself
right
many times over when you get a system that goes offline for 2 months and no one realizes it, and then you see that happen. So to me, it's a real no-brainer. And I would imagine most, if you're a commercial building owner, the last thing you want to worry about is like, what's happening with the solar on my roof, and is it performing the way it should, and all that kind of stuff. Like trust an expert to be able to do that, and absolutely got enough on your plate probably to delegate that to an expert that does that and can monitor it and catch that as quick as possible. So it makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, it's not their core business, right?
Right.
So, their core business is, to operate the hotel, make sure their customers are happy, focus on that. Our core business is solar. So, let us focus on that for them. Well, unfortunately, there was a lot of groups out there that were running around, selling solar as a set it and forget it sort of mentality. You install it, you never have to worry about it again. It sits there for 20 years, 30 years, produces, you never have to clean it, never have to do anything. Well, that's not the case. All electronics have to have some sort of maintenance or some sort of management. I mean, even if it's just to go out and visually check the system once every few months or once a year. I would say, 80 to 90% of the issues that we've run into over the years that we've been doing solar from a maintenance standpoint have been from animals.
Yeah. Right.
Just nesting or whatever else in the system, and, chewing a wire or, something like that. That's not a normal, not a normal electrical malfunction. Right.
Yeah.
We've seen some, vandalism, kids throw rocks up on things, stuff like that. So,
yeah, absolutely. Anything, I guess, sitting out in nature, you can expect some degree of something's going to happen. So let's zoom out a little bit for a second and talk about, you've had a front row seat to what happens when just politics and power collide, literally. And we talked a little bit about this in a previous conversation around, Mexico and some of those examples there. And I want to hear how that experience just reshaped your thinking around risk and also opportunity. So walk me through just that example in terms of like what happened in Mexico, how it shaped your thinking on policy risk.
Yeah. So, and it's interesting because looking at what happened in Mexico over the past 6 years, really, I feel like we're seeing it here in the U.S., what they just went through. So, we started focusing on an expansion into Mexico. It was probably about 7 years ago.
Yeah.
Got O3 set up in Mexico to do business. Had a lot of projects going, moving forward. And then with the last president that was there, whenever he took office, he just came in and basically killed all the energy projects that were going on in Mexico. Basically canceled all the power purchase agreements that were happening on the utility scale side of things. And then was, a little hostile towards some of the behind the meter solar that was going on there as well. So there was a real push that killed the momentum there as far as energy. What happens whenever you continue to develop real estate and continue to have population growth and you're not installing new electrical generation at all? What's going to catch up to you? You're going to have more load than you're going to have generation. And that's the issue that they're having down there now. Luckily, the current president is a little bit more forward thinking whenever it comes to renewables. And there's been a big push now to catch up in a way. They're having bad rolling blackouts throughout the country. The energy prices have shot up as well. And, I think that's kind of foreshadowing what's probably going to happen here in the U.S. with our current administration and some of the things that they're doing. But, now we're back in Mexico operating with a lot of projects on our pipeline and, moving forward. And it's helping us to diversify with what's going on here in the U.S. So it's kind of been it started off being a negative, and now it's kind of turning into a positive, right?
Yeah. And such the solar coaster continues.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Just, going back to what we were talking about earlier of, let's just wait and see, like it's going to change, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of thinking about that too. So just thinking about how you evaluate risk and reward when entering a volatile but high potential market. I mean, you mentioned obviously you were there. Obviously, you're doing a lot there now again as well. What's the thought process, and how do you look at that? How you evaluate that risk and reward?
So, us being based in Texas has always had a very, very good relationship with doing business in Mexico. All the oil and gas companies do it. I mean, we're right here on the border with Mexico. It's always made sense from a Texas standpoint.
Yeah.
So, for us moving into Mexico, it made a lot of sense. They have some of the best solar resources that you can see as far as a country around the world. So, it's only a matter of time before they really get to the point where the U.S. is with solar. And so with us moving into the market, obviously we align ourselves with some of the local groups there, and we have local partners as well to help guide us through some of the nuances of a new market. And I think that's important with any group in any new market, and something that has to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I want to get to, just thinking about the public conversation and stepping into the narrative side of this a bit. You've made some really compelling comparisons between the clean energy shift and then past transitions. And this is one of my favorite things to talk about now. So past transitions like electrification, like the rise of automobiles. I think it's a smart frame. It cuts through a lot of the noise, but you've drawn comparisons between that, today's transition to solar and renewable energy and past shifts like electrification and automobiles. Tell me where that came from. Like, what sparked that analogy for you?
I mean, it's just honestly really started with, I'm somewhat of a car enthusiast, right?
Yeah.
And I love EVs. Yeah. And, for me, the specs on a Tesla are better than some of the specs on some of the internal combustion engine vehicles, right?
Yeah.
Vehicles. And so it's always been a discussion between me and friends or other car enthusiasts of, the things that they love in a car and why they need a combustion engine, And I'm like, do you really need that? The things like the sound, right? Like
Yeah.
the exhaust sound. And yeah, so mainly the exhaust, the feeling of the vibration,
Yeah.
all of that. And it's like, well, so it got me thinking one day, did people really have this much pushback whenever it came to switching from horse and buggy to a combustion engine car? Like,
Yeah.
there's people get upset that there was no more smell of horse shit in the road, right? It's just, these are the pollutants that these cars are putting out.
Yeah.
And that's what's exciting about the car. It just doesn't make sense. So it kind of got me on that path of going down looking at the transitions from non-electricity to electricity, and going from horse and buggy to a car. And, now we're going through another transition along the same lines. And, what kind of issues did they have that now looking back at, we're like, that's just ridiculous.
Yeah.
Because I think that 100 years from now, people are going to look back at some of the pushbacks of the transition that we're having now and say, well, that was just ridiculous. I think one of the biggest ones when researching it was the fact that the lighting lamp industry was pushing back, their lobbyist was pushing back on street lights because, it took away from jobs of people going around and lighting lamps on the street. Now you're looking at that, you're like, that's just ridiculous. But that was important to them at the time, And so, like I said, I think that we're going to look back at all this, years from now, our grandkids, and be like, that's just ridiculous that you guys had to deal with that somebody didn't want to switch to an EV because they enjoyed the pollution that was coming out of the back of the vehicle,
Yeah. When you frame it up that way, it really does. You're like, God, that's silly. Like, but it's true. I think oftentimes we're in our own little bubble in our own little world, and we can't see it, can't see the forest through the trees, as they say. But, you fast forward down the road, and I do really think we're going to look back and be like, God, why were people so resistant to that? That makes no sense whatsoever. But it's very similar to that. I love these comparisons because I think people can get their head around it and understand it, and we start framing it up this way. But you're right. There's been resistance to every major technological revolution there's ever been,
Right.
in the history of the world. But we look on the other side of it. And I think what gives me hope for the industry is like, have you been able to stop one yet? Have you been able to halt, that permanently? And the answer is no. Probably
Right.
you can resist, you can slow it, you can make it a little bit more painful. But at the end of the day, progress is going to happen. And to your point, like it's in a lot of ways a superior product. My electric stuff, I promise you, works better. And that continues to improve as well too. So I think it's cool. I think it's cool making those comparisons. I love that we got into this and talking about it. And it's the same like the horse and buggy thing. Like people were like, oh, the automobiles scare the horses, and like all this kinds of stuff, like all these arguments where you're like, that's silly. But I agree. I think we're right in the midst of another one like that, right? And same with like dawn of the internet, what people fought against it. Dawn of AI, like we're seeing that too, real time, like people that are just resistant to it and all these sort of things. You're like, you're not gonna stop it. It reminds me too, I watched a video, we may have talked about this too. It was like when credit cards were first coming online.
Yeah.
And it was this video of them in like a fast food place, and just hearing the arguments was hysterical of people like, this is never gonna work. This is garbage. What is this? This is so stupid. And now we literally can't imagine life. Like we're annoyed when somebody pulls out cash.
Right.
We're
Right.
like, what are you doing? I gotta sit here and wait for change and all this. But yeah, so anyways, I think we're moving forward. Anything else in terms of like, in your view, what's the most misunderstood resistance to renewable energy right now? Is there anything else that we haven't hit on there?
I would say the biggest push against renewable energy that you see that's just very uneducated is that renewable energy costs more than, conventional or traditional energy. And you see the cost come down over time, and it's just going to continue to come down because you don't have a feedstock, so it's really just the cost of the technology itself. It's not, varied by that feedstock like some traditional energy is. And, renewable energy used to be the alternative energy, right? And now I think that it's become the most mainstream energy, and really, fossil fuels have become the alternative energy. You're seeing more and more renewables being put onto the grid and less fossil fuels. And there's a reason for that. And, I think it's only going to continue to move down that path, or we're going to see continued growth within the renewable energy industry. So
yeah, when it comes up, what do you say to people who frame energy progress as a political issue rather than a technological or an economic one?
it doesn't make any sense to me. It's at the end of the day, it's technology, right? Like, I don't know how technology became so politicized over the years, and it seems like it's mainly here in the US. You don't see it as much in other countries. It's become to wherever renewables is the mainstream there, and you don't get that pushback like you do here in the US.
No, agreed. It does seem to be a US problem. We're like, how we figured out how to make an electron a political argument, I don't know, but here we are. If you could make one change to how solar or renewable energy is communicated to the public, what would it be?
Well, I think you're seeing the change now, right?
Yeah.
For the longest time, I think the biggest push was, renewable energy, the global warming aspect of it. We're reducing carbon, and the effects of, greenhouse gases. And we totally forgot to market all of the other great attributes of renewable energy. And now I think with what's going on in the industry, you're seeing that shift to those other aspects of, solar can be done on a distributed scale where a lot of other energy generation technologies cannot. Even if you remove the greenhouse gases out of it, just air quality in general, you don't have those issues. There's tons of other aspects of renewable energy that we should really be marketing, and we didn't do so for so long. And I think it's really going to be a catch-up game of, educating the general masses on these other great aspects of renewable energy that are outside of the wheelhouse of global warming.
Yeah, no question. Hands down, that would be mine as well too. So I don't think you could pick a better one. And it is cool to see it happening. You are starting to see that narrative and that story change, and people just really talking about the economical side of it and just how it's it's a better product and a superior product and time and all the different things. You can make 20 different arguments for why it's beneficial and why it's good and why it makes sense, regardless of how you feel about the environment one way or another, which again, I think to get mass adoption and buy-in, that's what's needed. And you are seeing I am seeing it, some really talented marketing and comms people coming into the industry that have been in the industry and really doing a great job. And I think that's one of the most important functions in the industry, period, for that reason.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah. Kind of transitioning to getting closer to wrapping up and getting into our final piece here. So I want to pull back a little bit to the long view, and what you're building is bigger than just projects. It's about shaping culture, leadership, and the way the industry evolves. So for you, what legacy do you hope O3 leaves behind? Not just in energy, but how business is done.
From the growth and the trajectory of O3 Energy over time, we've had some transitions, we've had some changes and the way that we do business, our offering, and we've continued to pivot with the industry. And at the end of the day, we've always had this mindset in the back of our head that it's, powering with purpose, right?
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, I hope that that's the legacy that we leave behind, is that, it wasn't just about selling electrons, that there was a purpose to what we were doing here. And, we're going above and beyond to really change the industry, change not just renewable industry, but change the energy industry in general. And that would be the legacy that I would like to leave behind.
Yeah, it's good stuff. And what's the belief that keeps you in this fight after 15 years? We've talked about it throughout, but I'll, be able to put a bow on it. And really, what still excites you about what's ahead?
The belief that drives me is making a difference in the world.
Yeah.
The energy transition is the most critical challenge of our time, and we're positioned at the heart of it. So it really excites me, and every day getting up and being able to be a part of it.
Yeah, and just kind of final thoughts. What does success look like for you in the next phase of O3's life cycle? We fast forward out, 10, 15, 20 years. What do you hope that success will look like?
I would say success for us would be to be part of whatever the next innovation is. Continue to bring that innovation to everyone. There's going to be some other technology down the road that is the next transition for energy, the even bigger and better thing for everyone else. So it's technology. It's always going to be innovating. It's always going to be getting better.
Yeah, I love it. And final question, just any other parting words of wisdom, advice, things you didn't get to share, talk about? What do you want to leave the audience with?
Yeah, no, it'll be okay. The industry will always find a way, and just stick with it and never give up.
There you go. Never give up. I love the hope message and agree completely. So with that, we will wrap up today's episode with Brad Stutzman. Brad, thank you not just for your insights, but for the way you bring patience, clarity, and forward motion to the industry. These are the kinds of conversations that help really cut through the noise, remind us what leadership in renewables really looks like. And to our listeners, as always, thank you for tuning in. If this episode gave you something to think about, something to share, something to build on, send it to someone who's on this journey too. And don't forget to subscribe to the show and leave us a review, and check the show notes for some links. And with that, we'll see you soon.
This episode of Green Giants, Titans of Renewable Energy, was brought to you by Lead Group Search. If you enjoyed today's discussion and are looking to recruit top talent for your company or find your next career opportunity in the renewable energy sector, visit leadgroupsearch.com. Let's continue driving the future of clean energy together. Until next time, keep pushing toward a greener future.